Welcome everyone to this briefing brought to you by the Israel Defense and Security Forum, IDSF. In Hebrew, our name is Abitonistim. IDSF is the leading Israeli organization advocating for strong national security to defend Israel. Thank you to all of our viewers. Thank you to all of our supporters for tuning into this briefing. It's a great privilege to be joined once again by Danny Seaman. Danny's the former IDF spokesperson, the former director of the Government Press Office. Danny, thank you so much for joining.
It's my pleasure. Good to be with you all again.
Let's begin, if we can, with just a general update, your thoughts on the war, what's happening this week from your perspective, what it's important for our viewers to know, and then we'll dive into some deeper questions.
It's funny you say my thoughts on the war. War is bad, but we'll be serious for a moment. This has been our life for the past over 9 months now. Daily update today, since I guess I'm in the military position right now to give them. The main issues for Israel, and I wrote these down so we don't miss any of them. Main issue for the Israelis today is basically, or more importantly, the incident that occurred on the Golan Heights last night, in which in a barrage of missiles towards the north of Israel being fired by Hezbollah and other elements, by the way. This is not always mentioned. Yesterday on the Golan Heights, which are more to the east of the north of Israel and certainly to Lebanon, there was fired there also, and these unmanned aircraft, and they attacked and assaulted a vehicle, a civilian vehicle. And it's interesting to see that nobody talks about the attacks against civilians in Israel. And just as they don't speak about the nearly 100,000 Israelis who've been displaced in the north of Israel, no mention, no talk about that either by the international community. That sort of seems to be acceptable. But in this particular place, we had two people, Noah and Nir Baranis, of a kibbutz in the Golan Heights, who were on their way home. They left 3 children, 3 teenagers, without their parents. They were both killed yesterday. They moved to the Golan Heights about 10 years ago. The funeral is being held as we speak. And the brother of Nir mentioned the fact that out of Zionism, they moved and took their family, who are now orphans. They took them to the Golan Heights about 10 years ago, and their funeral is being held at the moment. This was a direct, deliberate hit against civilians, and you hear nothing about that. And that's unfortunate. That's the situation in the north. About 2 hours ago, there was an additional barrage of missiles there. They always have an excuse for it. They're saying now it's in response to the fact that Israel took out some of the top leaders of Hezbollah, and also that there are events in Syria as a consequence of Israel killing. I hear some of the reports say that the Syrians killed the press secretary of the Syrian president because she was discovered to be a spy, or her husband was a spy for Israel. And then there are others saying that they're responding now because Israel took her out. Israel wouldn't have taken out a press secretary. That's all I can say. The second area is in Gaza. The operations continue there as well. In North Gaza today, leaflets were dropped. And I'm saying North Gaza. North Gaza was the place that Israel moved into first over about 9 months ago. And now Hamas, after we finished those areas and moved into other areas, Hamas have moved back in. And some of the civilians also moved back into the places there. So Israel dropped leaflets today telling the civilians to take refuge in the secure areas to the south, because we're going back into these areas in North Gaza to eliminate the pockets of Hamas who have taken over there. The third region, as usual, is the hostage negotiations with Hamas. Israel sent a delegation today to meet with the CIA representatives and representatives for Hamas in Qatar. They still refuse to accept Israel's position. The main obstacle, there are 2 obstacles at the moment. Israel does not want to cease the combat. Second, we want all of the hostages released. The third point which was that we don't move back from the Philadelphia route. The Philadelphia is along the border with Egypt, and that has been the source of all the munitions being smuggled into the Gaza Strip. I just heard the Minister of Defense say that we could consider moving out of there in return for some kind of international promises. And I think we'll talk about so-called international promises in a moment. Those are the main areas. The fourth area, of course, is Judea and Samaria. Operations continue there. Today, we discovered, the IDF discovered 150 sacks of explosives that were smuggled in through the border with Jordan, and meant for creating booby traps and what the IDF has noticed, that the PLO operatives, the Palestinian Authority operatives in Jenin, Tulkarm, etc., are not confronting the IDF at the moment, but setting up booby traps. They're creating incidences, expecting the IDF to move in, and then try to take them out with these booby traps. And now we discovered a source of the explosives and TNT that was smuggled in, and this was taken today. That I think are the major issues. Is there were also a suspicious fire that occurred in a highly sensitive installation in Iran, and other explosives occurring in military installations in Iran, which is quite interesting. Wonder who could be doing with that. But those things are happening in Iran at the moment. If we want to see that there's the in-depth battle going on where Iran is using all its proxies, there are things happening in Iran as well at the moment. So that's the update.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing all of that. You know, we don't talk enough about the Jordanian border and the smuggling that has been happening for years from Jordan into Jericho. Do you have any information about the original source of those supplies? Meaning, how did they get to Jordan and where did they come from?
Well, there's been an effort also by the Iranians, and they also using Syrian militias to try to undermine the stability of Jordan, because they want to turn the border with Jordan also into an extension of the battle against Israel. So they've been using that and using elements there, but there's a lot of money involved, and there are also elements within Jordan itself. Just a few months ago, could have been over a year already with all that's been going on in the past 9 months, so you sort of lose track of time. But there was an incident where a Jordanian member of parliament was caught smuggling in weapons using his diplomatic immunity, and was caught smuggling in weapons through the border with Jordan. So we have to be aware and alert to all of that is happening, and make sure that they don't succeed with that. Now, an incident that I think the IDF, the Israel, the IDSF, the Bitronistim raised a few months ago, over a year ago, even before the war broke out, that a lot of the weapons that were discovered, smuggled in and being used by the Arabs in Judea and Samaria were actually weapons that had US serial numbers on them. And for that, you can detect that these were weapons that were left in Afghanistan. So it made its way from Afghanistan through Iran, through Iraq, to Jordan, using the proxies of Iran. And these munitions that were left by the United States and deserted by the United States when it deserted Afghanistan, they're now being used by these extreme organizations and terrorist organizations throughout the Middle East, and certainly in their assault against Israel.
You know, it's so sad that when the U.S. was disengaging from Afghanistan, people within our movement pointed out that we would see those weapons in the Middle East, and it's unfortunate that that prediction came to fruition. Danny, let's kind of zoom out a little bit more. We spent a lot of time talking about the war in Gaza, the escalations in Lebanon. We've spoken now a little bit about Jordan, but I want to focus a little bit on Syria, because there was just this operation in Syria wherein there were some targets of the Syrian army, and the 1974 disengagement agreement. I want you to discuss what exactly that agreement was. Are both sides following that agreement? And what can we expect in terms of escalations now, not just in Lebanon, but in Syria?
Well, it's very interesting that things here always have some way of continuing, and so we're going back to the Yom Kippur War, certainly the 6 Day War, when Israel was able to take control over the Golan Heights, which was used by the Syrians to assault Israel. And then in 1973, in the Yom Kippur War, where Israel was able to push them back several kilometers into Syria, and we were about 13 kilometers, I believe, away from the capital, from Damascus. And at that point of the war in Yom Kippur in 73, we could use just regular artillery to bomb the Syrian capital. So as part of the disengagement, when the war ended on October 23rd, part of the negotiations were held both with the Egyptians and also with the Syrians. And for Israel to withdraw from those areas beyond the Golan Heights, which it went into in pursuit of the Syrian troops, for us to move back, there were international guarantees, the United States, the UN, etc., not only moving us back, but also how many forces can be held by each side. I'm personally familiar with that with my term when I served in the military between 79 and 83. In the paratroopers, we were up there on the Golan Heights, so we were familiar with how many troops we're supposed to have, what kind of weapons we can have in all our positions along the Golan Heights, but also where Syrians may or may not be, where they may go to or where they may not go to, and what kind of munitions they can have there. And apparently they've been violating this. Now, we know they've been violating it for a while through Iran, Iranians themselves. And a few years ago, there were top leaders of Iranian military personnel that were killed in that area because they were closing in on the Israeli positions and using it to attack Israel. And we were able to take them out at the time. But now that with the cover of the recent war going on, they thought that they can move into these places and establish footholds there with the possible attempt or interest of eventually attacking Israel. So Israel was able to take these out. Now, just so you know, the disengagement agreements can be addressed in the United Nations Security Council, but the United Nations Security Council never gives an honest and a sincere response to Israel's concerns, and there's always excuses made for it. So now they'll condemn us for taking action against the Syrians there, but who cares? It doesn't really bother us at the moment. But I think it very much symbolizes, and this is very important for the negotiations going on right now, because a lot is being said, certainly by elements inside of Israel, and this is being reflected abroad, where people are telling us, just as they've told us in the over nearly 20 events that have gone on since our leaving the Gaza Strip, with the withdrawal from the Gaza Strip over 20 years ago, we have been promised certain things over these years, not to mention with the Oslo agreements that there were certain things that were promised to Israel, not to mention UN Resolution 1701. And if we want to go back to history again, to the 1957, after the 56 war, we withdrew from the Sinai in return for promises from the United Nations. And then 10 years later, 67, these were all violated. So it just repeats itself. Israel gets international guarantees. These are never kept. And the United Nations, which tries never upholds these promises. And now they're trying to do the same thing with the Gaza Strip, say to us that if we do this or that, the international community will guarantee. Well, the international community, which includes France, for example, the EU, were guarantors of the Oslo agreements. And the Oslo agreement stipulates very clearly that they're not to recognize a state of the Arabs in Judea and Samaria until such time that it's reaching an agreement between the Jews and the Arabs. And yet France, Spain, Ireland, and others have already recognized the PA of creating a state there in total disregard of these promises made to the past. So as usual, you can ignore things and promises made to the Jews because Jews are second-rate citizens.
So aside from the diplomatic issues, just in terms of war on the ground, is there a concern that Israel could be faced with a direct war from the Syrian army?
There's not really a Syrian army anymore. There are many in Syria right now. There's a lot of, there are battles going on between the Syrian government, the Assad government, and a lot of the individuals throughout Syria. Both in Syria and Lebanon, these elements have said to not only the government, also said to Lebanese government as well as Syria, if they go to war against Israel, it's not that they're going to be joining us. They're going to take advantage of the situation to do what they feel is necessary in their own countries. The Syrian opposition to hopefully dismantle the Iranian-controlled government of Syria. People are not familiar with the religious backgrounds of this. The Alawite minority, which are about 10% of the Syrian population, are a sect of Shia, and they control Syria, which is a majority of Sunni. So the Syrian people are not happy with the Alawite regime there. And they'd be more than happy for them to be weakened to the position. We know that just a few years ago, there was a full-out civil war in Syria, in which over 500,000 people died, and you didn't hear all these people marching in the streets of the United States and Europe say anything about the genocide going on there at the time. But they're just looking for the opportunity. So we're already at war with Syria because they've allowed Iranian proxies to use Syria as a launching pad against Israel. And it's just the way that we're already at war with Lebanon because of Hezbollah, but it's very low-key at the moment, and this could certainly escalate. And just like with Gaza, it has to be very clear that for Israel, this is no longer another round of battle. For us, we're going to eliminate any future threats to the state of Israel.
Thank you, Danny. Thank you, of course, to all of our viewers for sending in questions either now during the chat or prior to this briefing to my email. Danny, I want to switch topics and discuss something that I think we're going to see in the news a little bit more now, which is these IDF probes into the activities of the IDF on October 7th and thereafter. So, for example, tomorrow, there's findings that are going to be presented to the residents of Kibbutz Be'eri in terms of how the IDF conducted themselves on October 7th. Are you able to give us a little bit of a perspective on what our orientation should be as these probes are coming out? What can be expected? And are these kind of fact-finding missions? Are they trying to paint the IDF in a certain light? What is the general understanding we have of how this will unfold?
This is not painting, and it's not the certainly the inquiry that will have to be. This is also going to be, anybody who follows what's going on in Israel will have a lot of political ramifications. But at the end of the day, both the government and other elected politicians, be it right-wing, left-wing, they are the representatives of the people of Israel. And the state of Israel failed its most important responsibility, which was the protection of the people of the state of Israel and the Jewish people in the land of Israel. Nobody's arguing that. There was an utter failure on October 7th. The reasons for this are far-reaching. They go back to many different aspects that have to be addressed, and how the military and its whole perception of the maintaining of how and what they're supposed to be doing. I can just give you a simple thing. It's not that complicated. The military's role, and the one they failed in on October 7th, is providing protection for the people of Israel. They didn't do that October 7th. So the military itself is looking into the technical aspects. What went wrong? We know what the consequences were. Now they're trying to see what exactly was the problem. Some of the things have been released, but they're keeping the entire thing. First off, because it was the kibbutz itself, they want to present it to those who suffered the most. I believe that in Be'eri, they had nearly 100 people killed, and there are also several hostages from the kibbutz itself. So they definitely are owed an explanation of what happened there. But just from what was going on and what we know through the media was that the military was not prepared for the onslaught. They didn't have the troops there. They didn't listen to the very clear. And this goes back to also the women soldiers who were listening and reporting. And there's some heart-wrenching reports from parents who lost their daughters that day, who show the text messages going back or report about conversations, some of them that were taped, that these women had when they went home, and expressing their concerns of what they fear is going to happen. And this was a month before the war. And yet the commanders disregarded the reports that were coming from these young women. And it's unfortunate that they had to go through horrible deaths, and not to mention those who are being held as hostages at the moment. So the military failed at that, but also there was the immediate response. Now, I can tell you again from my own personal military experience, I served also in the Gaza with the paratroopers. The basic thing that I remember as a reservist for 25 years in paratroopers and 3.5 years, including a war in Lebanon, the first war in Lebanon. The one thing you did every morning, especially when you were on the border, whether it's the border with Jordan or with the Gaza Strip or in the north, certainly when you were in Lebanon. But any place you don't have control, if you're on a border at dawn, you wake up early, the troops are alert. This went out even when we were guys in the reserves along the border with Jordan, which was a peace border some of the years that I did my reserve duty there. And yet every morning at 6 o'clock at dawn or whenever dawn occurred, we were up alert and waited in case something happens. And this did not happen on that day. And there was a failure also because of the holiday. A lot of troops were released home. There were a lot of things that happened there technically on the battlefield itself. Let's put it this way, there was no IDF on that day between 6:30 in the morning until very late in the afternoon. In the evening, I know from my son, who was a paratrooper, they were flown in because they were organized. They were preparing for a paratrooper brigade exercise that evening was supposed to begin when the Sabbath was out. So they were already, they had equipment and everything, so they were flown in. And they were the first responders in addition to the police forces who joined them in retaking the positions along the border, and also Be'eri and other kibbutzim along the area there. But that's a long, long time. So you had individuals, some of them serving in the military, others Israelis who had arms, who went down there and organized and took action. They're also addressing some of these incidents that happened. One of them, which was very clear, very early on, was used to discredit Israel by saying that Israeli troops are the ones who killed Israeli civilians. This was promoted by Haaretz newspaper, and then unfortunately by some politicians on the Israeli left who accused Israeli commanders who had come down there in killing. This is found to be absolutely not only wrong, but has no basis in reality. The combat was very difficult that was conducted there, and none of the civilians were killed by Israeli troops. And this investigation exposes that, and especially in Be'eri, when one of the incidents happened, because the people deserve to know the truth. And the civilians there deserve to know exactly what happened. And this is the purpose of these initial investigations. So these are very good and very important for the IDF to learn and to fix the mistakes. I also believe that once these are out there and once we complete the initial battle, which is very close in Gaza itself, the consequence of this will be that some of these commanders will have to be let go finally, because they've proven they are unworthy of being commanders in the IDF.
Now, Danny, I think your son's unit is still operating in Gaza. Do you have any updates you can share with us about what they are seeing, what they are experiencing, not on October 7th, but right now, today, this week?
That's very interesting. I mentioned this to you earlier. My son finished his mandatory service a few months ago. So last night, the Israeli television, the IDF spokesman, took in all television stations to join his former unit, the 890th Paratrooper Brigade. And so we sat and watched the reports, and all his buddies were there. And he pointed out, and he was giving me, while the camera was going on and the reporters were reporting what was going on, and they're in the Sajaiya neighborhood. Now, they had taken Sajaiya a few months back. So my son was personally there in the initial combat. So he's familiar, and he was pointing out different locations. And I'll be honest, when I was looking at what was the devastation, I told him, how do you recognize these places? I said, well, that's where we were before. Now, when they finished the combat at the time, they were able, well, they thought that they were able to eliminate Hamas, but Hamas returned, so they had to go back there. And he was showing me the new kinds of ammunitions they were using, the coordination going on between the Air Force and the infantry troops. This is all new kind of tactics that the IDF has developed. We were laughing about how back in my day, we're talking about over 40 years ago, it's almost like horses and elephants compared to what they're doing now. But if we had to use and engage our Air Force through our, first you go through our officer who was from the intelligence unit, who then spoke to the liaison, the intelligence liaison with the Air Force. And there's so many opportunities to have mistakes going on. And unfortunately, my unit, we suffered for that in the first Lebanon war. Right now, they have people that are with them who are officers who go through training with the paratroopers, and then they do training with the Air Force, and then they liaison directly with the Air Force. And it's amazing what is going on there. They can identify, and today you have all these cameras on all these unmanned aircraft that are flying around. You know, these kids are kids, you know, they're the officers and the soldiers. All the toys they played with are now being used in the battlefield. I call them toys, but these are military equipment adapted to the technologies that they grew up with. So it's amazing to see how they're implementing it in the battlefield. I'm able to identify through these cameras on these things terrorists that are taking cover in the ruins of the facilities there, identify them, and immediately take them out without having the soldiers have to engage them. So those are the interesting things that I saw there. But just to bring to the people listening in and watching us, so there is tremendous devastation going on in Gaza. Now, I'm not denying it. I take immense pleasure in seeing that. But to be serious for a moment and address it when you're being accused of different things, if you're a supporter of Israel, just so you're familiar with what's going on there. This is not devastation due to the will of Israel to cause hurt and pain and destruction. It's a direct consequence of what is going on. And this, my son told me while they're staying in a building. He showed me where, and this is what the IDF soldiers discovered. Every house, and Sajaya is a very affluent neighborhood. There, as well as in the more poorer areas, every place had facilities, had a room, had tunnels going to them, that when a terrorist who's in civilian clothing roams around, they know to go into every building and every place and know where to find the weapons that are hidden there. So eventually, every one of these places, according to the international law, which is very quickly to be used to be shoved in our faces, every place that is used to assault our civilians becomes a legitimate target under the same international law that people know to tell us about. So we have no choice but to take these things out. And the devastation in Gaza is a consequence of what Hamas did. They used, and I said this back 20 years ago during the war in Lebanon with CNN. There was an incident in the Kaaba, Kfar Kana in Lebanon. We in Israel cannot be more responsible for the civilians in Lebanon at that time, certainly in the Gaza Strip, than their own leadership. Our first responsibility, like any country, is the civilians in our country. And therefore, if we have to take out, and we have the international right to do that, to take out any facility used against us. And that's why you're seeing the situation in Gaza, because all of Gaza were military installations or facilities used by terrorist organizations against Israel.
Yanni, Seaman, thank you so much for joining this briefing. It's always a pleasure to hear from you, learn from you, and get a little bit of your passion for what you're doing. Thank you to all of our viewers and supporters for tuning into this briefing. We will not be holding a briefing tomorrow. We will be back with you Monday, 10 a.m. Eastern Time, 5 p.m. in Israel. But if you are on our mailing list, you will be receiving tomorrow some very important research that we have produced from IDSF. So this is a nice plug to sign up for our mailing list if you do not receive it, so you can see some of the work that we have been up to. Until then, stay safe, stay strong. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.